Aloha, I'm Joshua Cooper, and welcome to Cooper Union. What's happening with human rights around our world on ThinkTech Live, broadcasting from our downtown studio in Honolulu, Hawaii, and Moana Nui Akea. Today, we're looking at Indigenous Mekong youth making a global stance. The Khmer Krom are demanding sustainable development and self-determination. The Khmer Krom are the indigenous peoples in the Mekong Delta in the southern part of currently Vietnam. They are demanding dignity through diplomacy, and the Khmer Kampuchea Krom Federation youth are attending the 22nd annual UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, focusing on the special theme of Indigenous peoples, human health, planetary and territorial health, and climate change, a rights-based approach. Today, we're joined by an amazing activist who is very much involved in making a difference for her people at the UN, but also preparing for the upcoming UN high-level political forum. Connie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, or good evening, rather.
Connie, what inspires you to be involved and to take time from your regular work to be able to go to the UN and participate, to have the voice of your people heard in the global arena?
Well, for myself, I work in healthcare, and a lot of the work that I do is in regards to health and social determinants of health in a hospital setting, in a doctor's office. And so with my ethnicity and with my identity as an Indigenous person, with my family having an Indigenous background, being a part of the diaspora of the Khmer Krom people, there was intersectionality in regards to the health that I was seeing on a day-to-day basis, and then the health of those back home in Kampuchea Krom. So with that being said, in regards to getting involved in the work, it was more of just the sheer determination to understand more about my culture, understand more about my Indigenous identity, and how I can learn from a Western perspective of social determinants of health, and learn more instead about Indigenous health, as well as the determinants of health in that regard.
No, you did a really great job to connect your current career, but more importantly, with life and what matters most. And that aspect of identity, that aspect of being able to help your people and be able to combine the ancestral wisdom regarding health, regarding taking care of our land, with your skill set that you have in your career now in the health field. It fits in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but it also fits in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, really goal number 3 of looking at good health and well-being. Can you share with people, though, a little bit what a day is like at the UN Permanent Forum? What are some of the highlights? Why do people come, and what have some of the things you've learned during that first week coming into the second week now?
So the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues usually runs for 2 weeks. For the week, there is an agenda in which items are discussed either in the morning session or afternoon session. Those sessions will run about 3 hours, but in between there will be different side events from different organizations, different Indigenous Peoples organizations, explaining what's going on in their region, as well as UN agencies. So from a day-to-day basis, what we do, the Kampuchea Krom Federation, we prepare for these said items to sign up, register, make sure that we make it in time in order to be a part of that speakers list. And from there, the permanent forum members will go over who's registered to speak, and they will decide whether there is a pattern of having Indigenous people speak, as well as member states, as well as UN agencies. So that's generally what it looks like structurally. But on a day-to-day basis, it's just very exciting. It's very exhilarating to see the different information that's coming from the experts talking about the thematic studies that they're working on, as well as Indigenous peoples and what they're doing that could possibly benefit us as a Indigenous organization coming from the Asian region.
No, you're really highlighting a lot of the main points. And when you look at it, it's true. The mornings are sometimes regional caucus, reviewing some of the documents that you've prepared to share with the experts, making sure the recommendations are strong and sound and could lead to social change on the ground. And how does the KKF, where do they obtain their information from to be able to participate and give the latest information on the ground to the global arena to make sure that advocates can unite to make sure that life is better for the people inside Kampuchea Krom?
So for myself, it is always an honor to speak on behalf of my Indigenous brothers and sisters back home. Again, they don't have the same opportunities being at Kampuchea Krom to be able to go to the forum and present the issues themselves. Where we are as an organization, it's been years in the making in regards to having people not only know what we do to advocate for their rights, they're more open now to sharing that on social media. It would be privately earlier when our organization started, but now they're really voicing out the human rights violations that they're facing, the discrimination that they're facing on a daily basis. We're learning as soon as a week's time, a month's time. And so it's pretty much, if it's not firsthand, they are definitely directing that information to us. And so they want to share what they're going through, as well as give us those reports. They're showing us pictures, videos. So social media is a very powerful tool. But individually, there are certain cases where they will come to our organization and let us know what's going on, and we work from there.
No, I remember at an earlier permanent forum, there was a monk who had been detained and then disrobed and disappeared, and we wanted to make sure it wouldn't be death. So we kicked into action within 24 hours, and we know that monk now is able to be teaching Khmer language, which he wasn't able to do in his homeland, and even was working and helping in Philadelphia at the temple there on Geneva Way. So it is exciting to see that we can take that information from the ground, where in a country that you're not able to actively organize for, and we can actually see a shift. We can see since that time, there are more youth that are brave, that are very bold in their actions to demand their rights. Today, know their rights in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They know on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights what their rights are. And even those global goals, you see them with the rainbow and those aspects of the 2030 agenda, demanding dignity, but more importantly, what you were sharing earlier, to be able to demand their own identity as Indigenous peoples has been quite powerful.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And it's definitely in the making, especially with what we do at the UNPFII. We like to also share that on social media. And so they will learn, not only are they learning about the UN DRIP, at this time, we're really trying to push for having the Khmer Krom people learn more about Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, in regards to what they can do in regards to their participation with the member state Vietnam, and how to better achieve those goals with Indigenous youth, with Indigenous knowledge. And so that's something that we want to work towards, an open dialogue with said member state, but as well as with UN agencies. So we've definitely came a long way from the UN DRIP not being in our Indigenous language to now it being accessible to the Khmer Krom people back home. Now, unfortunately, we did mention in this forum with some of the items is that even with that accessibility to use the UN DRIP to exercise their rights, there is reprisal. As recent as this year in March, with celebrating International Women's Day, we had a few individuals that were later questioned and then intimidated for just speaking on Indigenous rights and advocacy of Khmer Kampuchea people.
No, and you really brought up so many points. We can go in multiple ways. First and foremost, it reminds me of the International Service for Human Rights Defenders Declaration 25th Anniversary Workshop that took place on Thursday, because that really was sharing how to help people, the human rights defenders such as yourself, but the people on the ground when they stand up for their rights, what we can do around the world, identifying those gaps and seeing what's possible. Can you share a bit about that workshop that the International Service for Human Rights held and why the Human Rights Defenders Declaration is so valuable on its 25th anniversary?
So last Thursday, with that workshop, it was very enlightening for myself as a person that often refers to the UN DRIP. Using that document for human rights defenders was something that isn't often mentioned or shared throughout the session, especially with items not only from my organization, but other Indigenous peoples organizations, as we all are advocates, we all are human rights defenders, as well as those back home that aren't able to attend the forum. What we learned is not only the timeline in which it was created, but also how it can apply to each and every one of us. With the 7 different regions of the world, it was very insightful to see the different folks coming from different regions, from the Pacific, from Africa, from South America, just discussing how this may apply to them. For us as in the Asian region, our concern or our issue is primarily member states like Vietnam do not recognize Indigenous peoples, whereas in other countries, they do recognize their Indigenous peoples. And for us, it might be a little bit more to take those steps in order to be recognized before realizing that we are also human rights defenders. But again, it was a very valuable training program that I wish everyone was able to attend to really learn more about how you can utilize it, as it is not a legally binding document, but it is something that anyone could really use.
True, it does give the good guidelines as well as a strong framework for fundamental freedoms. But as you said, having that exchange to be able to talk between the 7 regions to identify the gaps, but then more importantly, come up with a strategy of what we can do to make it a stronger instrument and how we can also help those on the front lines who are exercising their rights. And really, you can see the interconnectedness of all human rights, that you have the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, and that all of our rights are so interconnected that we must stand up for one another. So it's not only sustainability that's talked about, but it's also the solidarity for one another. And when you mentioned as well the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that reminds me of what's coming up very soon. We know in July will be the UN High-Level Political Forum. And at that high-level political forum, there will be over 40 countries, roughly 4 dozen countries being reviewed in something known as a voluntary national review. And in that voluntary national review, they will see how Vietnam is doing on those 17 goals: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender justice, clean water, looking at the important aspect of renewable energy, decent work and economic growth, looking at innovation and infrastructure, and also looking at the important aspect of reducing inequality, which you have highlighted so well in what people face on a daily basis in their own homeland. And then looking at human rights cities, sustainable cities and communities, looking at responsible consumption and production, and of course, climate action 13, 14 life below water, and 15 life on land, and 16 absolutely at the heart of all the work you're doing, looking at peace, justice, and strong institutions. And 17 is partnership. And that's, I think, the strength that KKF is in partnership and has not forgotten where they've come from, and still make sure that anytime a review takes place, such as this voluntary national review, that the voice of the people is heard loud in the halls of the UNGA. And so while we were there, of course, at the PFII, it was a time also to educate countries that this is the permanent forum, and we appreciate your involvement here, but please listen to the voice of the people. One of those side events was saying, here is all of the world's indigenous people saying, these are our concerns. Please raise those during the review that voluntary national review that'll take place in mid-July of 2023. Could you share a bit of some of the issues you think are most important related to any of those 17 global goals that must be on the agenda this summer at the Voluntary National Review?
So when we're looking at Vietnam and the Voluntary National Review, this year it'll be their second review. And what they're doing as the organization, Kampuchea Krom Federation, what we're doing is comparing what they've done from the first time that they had the Voluntary National Review. In regards to the certain themes and goals that we would like to see progress with this Voluntary National Review is what they're doing in regards to climate change. What are they doing in regards to partnerships with Indigenous peoples? Now, referring back to the UNPFII, we would often hear Vietnam respond to some of the statements, the testimonies that we're making, constantly denying us as Indigenous peoples, stating that they are working in partnership with ethnic minorities, regardless of class. But again, it totally dismisses Indigenous peoples and their identity. As again, Khmer Krom people are not just the only Indigenous people in Vietnam. So what we're doing is seeing what they're doing in regards to their partnerships. We know that they are definitely working with UN agencies to get funding to become more sustainable and create green projects. Now, with these said green projects, there's not a lot of participation of Indigenous peoples. And so we would like to ask if there is any. A lot of the projects that we're seeing is definitely located more north and north central Vietnam. So we'd like to definitely see that in the southern Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, how these green projects up north will affect the Mekong Delta as it streams down. So climate change is definitely on the agenda for us in regards to seeing what they'll say in regards to that, as well as the partnership and who they're working with to make sure that the goals are achievable.
And you really highlight one of the most important things is that the Indigenous peoples are coming to share and participate because they know the only way that a voluntary national review will work or the 2030 agenda can be accomplished is if the people are included. And it brings up the 5 Ps of the 2030 agenda. First and foremost, people. Second, looking at prosperity. We know with the discrimination Khmer Krom face just by being Indigenous, that they're not allowed to achieve those aspects that Vietnamese then propose and push forward to support the dominant people now inside the borders. Also looking at taking care of the planet, looking at partnership. But more importantly, I think what you can hear in the voice of the Khmer Krom youth is that urgency for peace, because it's all connected. And if we don't have peace and harmony and the people aren't able to have their rights, then we'll never have that. And I think that's in a way the earth democracy that's necessary to be able to have accountability and transparency, especially around this important issue of climate change. And when I think about what you're sharing, it reminds me of just some highlights of the week. I think the first one is that opening day, to be inside the UN General Assembly Hall, to hear the Secretary General admit and say, the wisdom of Indigenous peoples is what the world needs now more than ever, and asking if we'll all listen. And then even having Deb Haaland, the first Indigenous woman heading the Department of Interior that used to go against, of course, all the rights of Indigenous people. We can see a moving of the needle in the right direction towards nonviolence, toward nurturing, and towards a world we all want and demand. But then even those agenda items, what was it like when you saw for the first time Khmer Krom take the floor? I mean, we have a high school youth person taking time off from high school to then speak truth to power. What was that like when she made her speech? And then let's look at the response by the government afterwards. But what does it feel like to see a young 16-year-old, very similar to when you first went to the UN?
When I first went to that UN, I believe I was starting college. So I was 18, but 16-year-old in high school, man, that is surely something, because I know that after that, she probably had to go to classes and explain why she was out. But just seeing her be able to not only be engaged with the permanent forum, not in a speakers list, but through internet interactive dialogue. Now that is literally speaking to the floor, speaking to the permanent forum and everyone there, that these are the issues at hand. This is what we're going through as Indigenous women, as Indigenous children, youth, and this is what we're going through. That definitely ignited something in me as well, recalling when I first started, saying to myself, this is why I continue to go to the forum to present these issues, whether I'm facing them or not, it's affecting me as these issues are affecting my family members back home. Again, the Vietnamese government, or the delegate rather, he emphasizes that we are a foreign entity that is going against his country. And hearing that, it just makes you wonder that they're trying to create this dialogue where it's us against them, when really we need to work on partnership. And the overall theme of the forum this year is that Indigenous health is planetary health. Climate change, we need to take action on it, and it involves us to have a dialogue with each other in cooperation with one another, rather than to dismiss one another as political entities, as organizations with an agenda. Now, again, just seeing her do what she's doing, it shows that with the younger generations for Indigenous people, that knowledge is power, and knowledge is going to be going to the next generation. And what they'll do is continue to fight.
It's true. And as you said, the government was so adversarial. And you have a 16-year-old youth citing international law, providing a path going forward of reconciliation and mutual respect. And the response is one of, I believe they wanted her to be banned from the UN. So how afraid are you, and how out of touch are you when you're calling for the banning of an Indigenous people from their own permanent forum? And it's kind of a shocker that you only talk about ethnic minorities at a permanent forum on Indigenous issues. So what was the response from the other Indigenous peoples in the room? And I believe also an expert from the PFII responded immediately to the government's response to the address made by the Khmer Krom youth.
So in that same session, and again, it is within 3 hours after she had spoke, Vietnam had responded, stating again that this organization, the Khmer Kampuchea Krom Federation, is nothing but political, and that we have our agenda. We are misusing the forum because for whatever reason. And what was really interesting to see was to have one of the permanent forum members, Mrs. Cove, be able to call out the Vietnamese delegate, stating that regardless of whether there is a political agenda or a reason to be there, it is in regards to overall human rights violations. So for her to mention that, to state it immediately after Vietnam had talked or had presented to the floor, that was the first time that I've ever seen or thought that the permanent forum member actually knew about our issues. It felt like we were seen, felt like they knew what was going on. And here we are in regards to addressing it, getting feedback. And that was one of the highlights of last week, for sure.
No, it was. You have a 16-year-old girl giving an intervention, highlighting recommendations, no less, of what could be done. And then the government's harsh response denying the basic dignity, but also the inherent right to self-identify as Indigenous peoples. And what's even more exciting is, though, that was just the beginning. And of course, it was great to see the permanent forum member stand in solidarity with the KKF, saying all Indigenous peoples have a right to be there, that the statements made by the government are in bad faith, but then to continue to give speeches. Can you share one or two of the other speeches that have happened. And I think even today you were speaking on the floor about the future agenda and looking at the UN Summit of the Future.
So for last week, we did have Sokantia, the 16-year-old, speak in an interactive dialogue. We also had item 4, which was the discussion of the 6 mandated areas of the permanent forum. And Emily, who is another youth, spoke on that in regards to human rights approach, measures that should be taken place in regards to having better adaptation and mitigation efforts towards sustainable goals. And for myself, this week, starting this week on Monday, I spoke on the future work of the Permanent Forum in regards to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and his report called the Common Agenda, and how we can use it as a thematic study or a follow-up in an Indigenous lens, and to see if, again, how Indigenous peoples could use that in regards to future sessions. And then also mentioning in September 2024, there will be the UN Summit of the Future, which is something that I personally would look forward to and think would benefit all people, including Indigenous peoples, to, raise their voices there in regards to a better future for Indigenous peoples.
And that's really the exciting part that you're able to share is, one, the UN Summit of the Future that's coming up in a year, which does capture that 7-generation perspective Indigenous peoples have. But then also, besides the important coming up of the UN High-Level Political Forum, the SDG Summit in September, looking at the halfway mark. And we really want to thank you for sharing the philosophy and practice to prepare for the Permanent Forum and how successful you've been so far, but also for that second voluntary national review of Vietnam that will take place, because we know we can see that the KKFU discussed the actions to achieve the UN 2030 agenda, especially SDG 13 climate action, building on the Paris Agreement, but also SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so we thank you for sharing with us about the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the upcoming UN High-Level Political Forum, providing an opportunity to organize on the ground, but also share the advocacy you've done at the global arena to achieve the UN 2030 agenda in your own ancestral homeland.
It's, again, an honor to be able to share any information in regards to the Khmer Krom people of Kampuchea Krom. Again, we like to not only share this knowledge, but also share with others, again, the tools that we use in order to, make our voices heard. Again, as an Indigenous organization, for us, we want to make sure that we live in a world where not only our Indigenous people can thrive in, but others as well.
Mahalo and Akun. Thank you so much, Connie, for sharing with us your experience and, more importantly, the next steps for justice for Khmer Krom.
Mahalo. Akun.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.